It's a pleasure to be here today. Again, my name is Tracy Boyer, and I'm an economist. Please don't hold it against me. I've worked a lot with Dr. Vogel and Dr. Storm and Dr. Fox on multidisciplinary grants. I'm also working with the Horticulture Landscape Architecture program at Oklahoma State on water conservation and drought-tolerant turf grass. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades in terms of applied research, and that was my goal in getting a degree in economics. One of my favorite places in Oklahoma is the Illinois River. I've done a lot of work on it since I came here in 2003. This is a picture of one of our PhD students, Trey Malone, out kayaking on the Illinois River. As you know, the Illinois River is part of the scenic rivers system in Oklahoma, and it is subject to litigation between the state of Oklahoma and Arkansas. And it's subject to a lot of poultry litter runoff and also runoff from increased urbanization upstream in Fayetteville and also in the Tahlequah area itself as people are choosing to build second retreat homes. So the question in this workshop is, how do we value what is avoided when a rainwater garden or erosion control or low impact development goes into play? So you can see an avoided cost, which is a loss of an amenity, as a benefit. So how do we value those benefits? And those benefits are things that we're not used to valuing. None of you has put a value on your last fishing trip, I would assume. You know that you bought a license, I hope, and you know that you paid gas to get there. These things are called non-market benefits, and unfortunately for you, I teach a whole 2 classes on this. But non-market benefits are things we're not used to valuing. A pretty view, a clear stream, a native stream bank in the Illinois. This is highly eroded, and that's because of the increase in water flow from development, agriculture, and basically the unstable soils as well. So the goal of this project was, this was a stimulus grant from the federal government to look at stream bank stabilization. And Dr. Vogel, Storm, and Fox wanted me to say, so how do we prioritize the benefits of that stabilization? Well, they only had 13 sites, so in the entire region of the Barren Fork and the Illinois and Tyner Creek, it wasn't going to really do much. But should we scale that up to where it had an impact? How are we going to prioritize those by the benefits that they provide and put a cost on that? So circa 1980, by executive order, we are required to do the benefits and costs of any major construction project. So this idea that we put benefits on creating a native riparian area with a vegetated bank, we have to know what the avoided cost of that development is. An avoided cost is a benefit. So we know that this stream bank, as the volume increases, becomes more eroded over time. And that erosion creates sedimentation, and that sedimentation decreases clarity. Now, for the last day and a half before this, I was at the Oklahoma Clean Lakes and Water Association conference that's being held at Oklahoma State. And I was very gratified to see that one of the presenters gave a talk on how chlorophyll and Secchi dish clarity are related, because one of the tenets in what I do in asking people, so how much is this worth to you, is ask them survey questions. And if you don't understand the survey question, garbage in, garbage out. So for this study, that was not what I wanted, home. Okay. We wanted to demonstrate and test the methods for stream bank restoration. Obviously, I was not part of that part, but I wanted to prioritize, and I keep hitting page end, prioritize the potential goals in terms of the series of attributes that decreasing that flow would benefit would create water clarity, improved habitat, numbers and species, recreational use, and stream bank appearance. I can't do everything, but those have to be associated with the reduction in flows. Now, I don't want you to get lost, so if you do have a question, I'm used to people interrupting me, and that's okay. So we actually did 2 studies. One we did as part of the study to look at the prioritization of those indicators I talked about before, and pro bono, we did another one because the Scenic Rivers Commission and people in the area have been fighting over floating permits for a very long time. So you have the numbers for the values we got from a travel cost survey. If I go to the Grand Canyon, I'm going to go from a very long distance, I'm going to pay for gas, I'm going to pay for lodging. We know that as a lower bound, your travel costs are at least as much as you value that resource. You might be willing to pay more if you've ever given money away to the World Wildlife Fund or to the Rainforest Action Network or the, any number of environmental groups. You know that people have larger values even for things they may never visit, like pandas in China, where the World Wildlife Fund would never have that as their logo. It's cute, it's cuddly, everyone knows what it is. We did a survey looking at kayakers and canoers, and we had students go to these sites on a number of random days and ask people what they spent to get there and where they came from. And we were able to put a value on a trip of about $87 a day. This is highly contentious. I gave a talk of a summary of this report, which I can easily send to anybody, to the Scenic Rivers Commission in December, and there were lots of raised voices. But this is what I love about my job, that the research, people care about what I'm doing. It doesn't sit on a shelf. So the idea is, if it's a local lake and you could go to any number of lakes, in Stillwater we have McMurtry and Carl Blackwell. Well, if you were just going swimming, you could go to either one of those lakes or Lake Boomer. And so it doesn't have that big of a value. But if you want to go kayaking or canoeing in Oklahoma, this is kind of it. The Mountain Fork, it has a kind of 4 or 5 mile area. That's nothing. You can do that in maybe 20 minutes, depending on the flow. The Illinois is it. And you can see, based on the dots of the people we did in our study, that they do come from far away and end up floating on the river. So that gives it a higher value than, say, a trip to Fort Gibson for swimming. But that's not predominantly what I wanted to present today because the presentation would be too long. I want to show you a cool way to prioritize attributes that you're not normally putting values on. This is somebody filling out our survey in person, but the results I'm going to give you today are from our mail-out survey to all of Oklahoma with an oversample for Northeast Oklahoma. So we had some interesting hypotheses. One was that we wanted to oversample in an area where we would get Native Americans. Because in the literature we talk about different values among different demographic groups, and it's never been quantified, except for a couple wildlife management areas in the West, whether Native Americans do actually show a preference for valuing the environment more than non-Native Americans. So that was one of our goals, to do it among different ethnic groups and incomes. So we did a conjoint choice mail survey, which sounds kind of daunting, but bear with me. This method is common in the business literature. Many of you may have filled out surveys in the mall before, and I know all of you have been to Staples to buy pens. So here I have 2 big pens. One I seem to have gotten from the office that doesn't have a lid. But assuming I go and I buy a 12-pack of pens, and this one's nifty and it writes in purple, and I went to Staples and I bought these purple Bic pens, and they were $1.20. And I bought a regular blue Bic pen, and it was $1 for a dozen of them. What is the value of purple? 20 cents. Okay, that's pretty easy. It's one attribute. You guys just did a statistical analysis. I'm proud of you. So in marketing, they do this with all sorts of things. You make these choices when you go to buy a car, when you get on Travelocity to make your next trip. Am I willing to give up a direct flight to pay $50 less? That's the kind of choice that you're making when you do those things. So in the conjoint choice analysis, what we can do is ask people very different products, vary those attributes. And if you make enough choices among varied attributes, we can control for the difference between blue and purple. We can control for the difference between 2 feet of depth and 8 feet of depth, clarity. And then we can also see if clarity is more important to you than water safety. Which do you think is going to be more important, clarity or lack of bacteria? Lack of bacteria, exactly. People are only so environmental as their personal self-interest. That goes for almost all products that you look at in the environmental economics literature. So we did a randomized survey in July 2012. We followed up according to the Dillman method, which is the Bible of doing survey technology. We send out a follow-up postcard, hey, you got our survey, where is it? And then within another 2 weeks, oh, really sorry you lost our survey, but please, it's kind of important, send it back. And then we got a response rate that was rather poor, even in my experience in Oklahoma. It was 14.17%. In my last 10 years, I've had a 20% response rate in Oklahoma on most surveys, and in Minnesota, they're more like 70 to 80%. And part of that is because of the type of survey that it is, and it's also that we're increasingly a less male-based society. And oversampling Northeast Oklahoma got us a very transient population. So the objective was to assign and prioritize the values. So we had these different attributes, water clarity, and the levels varied from 0 to 12 feet. And improvement of in-stream habitat species number, we kept very vague because the only species of interest were mussels, and we couldn't get numbers on those, and invertebrates. But the more things that live in there, you consider that all of the different species that depend on that system would be healthier. Recreational use, we had the different EPA designations, safe for all contact, safe for wading only, and not safe for swimming or wading. 10% of the season. We gave a realistic amount based on Ed Feit, the Scenic Rivers Commissioner's guess of when they had algae, and they recommended that people not stick their head underwater. Stream bank appearance, we had eroded banks visible, which was like the picture I showed you before, and revegetated with native species. And then in the survey techniques, where this is something where people, you can imagine, they can just outright lie. That's a negative. But usually their prioritization of them is correct, even if the number is overstated. We put it as a tax increase to the household. Death and taxes, according to most people, are fairly certain. So this is an example of how we varied those attributes. So you can imagine we had 5 by 2 by 4 increases into the thousands of choices. So we randomize them for option A. We pick an option that's a different random number and pair it. And then option C is always, I don't like your survey, I'm going to opt out. I would rather keep management of this river the way it is today. So you can see in this option, water clarity is better in option B, and so are the in-stream uses, and it's safe for all contact. It has revegetated with native species, but it's going to cost you lots of money. So you can see that this one's clearly dominant if you're really concerned about the environment, but it's going to cost you $75 more. But each person will answer 4 to 6 of these scenarios, and then we'll be able to control for the value of each of these. So each person is asked to pick one of those. So based on that, we run a conditional logit model, which is I chose A, conditional on seeing choice B and choice C behind it. And we have that tax payment, and because of that tax payment, we're able to take those coefficients and calculate a mean willingness to pay for that attribute. So how do we interpret these? Okay, so I really, really do not like when it's not safe for wading and swimming. That is a negative willingness to pay. What's a negative willingness to pay? Oh, that's, you have to compensate me to accept it. I expect you to make my taxes cheaper to accept the degradation of the Illinois River, Tyner Creek, and the Barren Fork. So I really don't like when it's not safe for wading and swimming. And behind that, because you saw it was a very simplified example, is really the E. coli, salmonella, and the algae growth warnings. And so a little better, this is safe for wading, and this makes theoretical sense. I don't like that one either, but I dislike it a little less than this, because now I can at least wade in it. And these are both compared to the option that is left out, which is safe for all uses, because you have to leave one out to avoid perfect collinearity in the variables. Okay, so what's next? The next thing that's important to me is I am very willing to pay for stream bank appearance. Okay. And I like improvement of habitat species numbers, and I am willing to pay $16.56 for every 2 feet of improved water clarity. So how does this give you a prioritization? First, I want you to clean it up. Second, I want to see native habitat with non-eroded banks, and I want to increase habitat species numbers and water clarity. Well, we all know that if you decrease stream bank stabilization, there'll be less, you increase the stabilization, there'll be less sediment, and all of these other numbers will be improved. Questions? So, individuals are willing to pay $85 a year for revegetation of eroded stream banks. Do we really think they're willing to pay $85 a day? Probably not, but we gave them a realistic payment vehicle, so at least prioritized within these, we know the prioritization. What does this allow us to do? Even if we have these numbers, which would be more realistic, we can put a value on these things for projects as benefits. Remember, avoided costs because we're doing something are really benefits. Okay, the cost of doing the restoration is the cost we would put in a benefit cost thing. So willing to pay $16.77 per year per household to improve habitat species numbers, and we're degrade it, we need to be compensated, and we need to be compensated even more if it's degraded for all uses. So these willingness to pay values give you a prioritization, and it would prioritize the removal of pathogens, which are controversial in terms of whether they're from native birds flying over, they're from the chicken litter itself, or they're from the cows that are wading in the stream when they're not fenced off in the 313 and the different payment mechanisms that are available in the scenic rivers for farmers to take them out, to get the cattle out. So, however, it does say Oklahomans do value these improvements, but they value the ones that affect their recreational use much more than the improvement for habitat. And you see those same results when you see people buy stuff at Whole Paycheck or Whole Foods. People are much more willing to pay more for produce because they think it affects their health if it's organic, but they're less likely to buy 7th generation laundry soap because, you know, in the grand scheme of things, that's really downstream, that's effective, that's a public good that you're paying for, not for you. Questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
I apologize if you covered this, but how do you account for what I assume is the fact that the respondents are the type that is going to greater value these improvements? So of that 14%, I'm assuming that population was probably more environmentally minded.
Okay, so it went out to everybody randomly, And you do get selection bias in who responds. You do get people who are opposed to the very idea of increasing taxes who also respond. So you don't totally get pro-environmental people. We did a lot more massaging of these numbers. Interestingly, we found out that those who were Native American did not have a higher willingness to pay, was insignificant. Women did, which we expect through the literature. But yes, you do get bias in who returns the survey. And the only way to really control for that is to see if your sample is representative of the region. And it was pretty representative. But I'd say that this was one of the most discouraging in terms of response rates of any survey that I'd ever done.
And why do you think that is?
We used an address-based sample instead of using a phone demarcated sample. So when you use an address-based sample and you pay for it, then you don't really know the name of the person at the house. But when you use a phone sample or a sample from, say, a utility or something, you have somebody's name and they're more likely to respond. And there's more likely to be somebody actually living there or that cares. I would say that we're at a crossroads in terms of internet surveys are kind of like the crack cocaine. You can buy a sample and people do this. You can make money on survey.com. Sign up for your weekends. It's like being on the Nielsen poll. But phone surveys are increasingly unreliable because of the restrictions on calling cell phones, random digit dial. People won't pick them up because they can actually see who's calling. There's a pro and a con to every technique that you do.